June 1967. Marlborough House, London. A plaque is being unveiled in memory of Queen Mary, who died 14 years earlier. Among those invited, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward, the man who gave up a throne, and Wallis, the woman the abdication was blamed on. Also among those invited, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, 66 years old, who had not shared a room with Wallis Simpson since 1936. They shook hands. Elizabeth said, "How nice to see you," and moved on. That was it. 31 years of shared history, the abdication, the exile, the letters patent, the blocked invitations, the 3 decades of orchestrated distance, condensed to 7 words and a brief exchange of palms. She had charmed presidents. She had waded through the bombed streets of the East End during the Blitz, said the right thing to people who had lost everything overnight, shaken the paws of stray dogs who wandered into official receptions in New Zealand, and made it seem effortless every time. For Wallis, she had 7 words and a grip that lasted less than a second. Then she moved on to the next person in the room, on to someone who mattered. The standard account of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's hostility toward the Windsors positions the abdication of December 1936 as the origin, the constitutional crisis, the duty abandoned, the shy second son left to carry a crown he'd never been prepared for. That account isn't wrong, but it's incomplete, because the frost was already there before the abdication gave it a justification, before it had a name and a letter patent, and a family united behind it. To find where it actually started, you have to go back to a proposal that was refused, and then refused again, and then accepted only after a week of deliberate consideration by a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing, and perhaps what she was letting go. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's famous, lifelong coldness toward the Duke and Duchess of Windsor reads less like principled disapproval than like a private wound that got dressed in constitutional language. And once you trace it backward past the abdication, to the marriage she almost didn't make, what came after starts to look like a very long settling of scores. To understand the weapons Elizabeth eventually used, you need to understand the household that manufactured them. George V and Queen Mary raised their children in a manner that was, even by Edwardian aristocratic standards, formally withholding. George V was, in his own biographer's account, a demanding disciplinarian father whose quick temper and strict military habits made him a near martinet. He told associates he was damned well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me. It wasn't a figure of speech. His children were presented to him at regular intervals like dispatches to be reviewed. Between those intervals, they were managed by nannies, tutors, and household staff, the institution of the family substituting for its warmth. Queen Mary admitted she felt emotionally ill-equipped to deal with her 6 children. Her reverence for the institution of monarchy was always paramount. When her husband was absent, she softened, reading to the children about royal history, laughing with them. When he returned, the formalities snapped back into place like a visor. The children spent their nursery years at York Cottage, Sandringham, in rooms called the day nursery and the night nursery. What they received from the adults charged with their care wasn't always benign. One early nanny, dismissed eventually, would pinch the boys before presenting them to their parents, specifically to provoke visible tears, so that when the children arrived red-faced and miserable, the parents would see children who needed to be handed back quickly. The abuse went undetected long enough to become habit. Another child, the youngest son John, who had epilepsy, was housed away from the main family entirely. These weren't the actions of actively malicious people. They were the actions of people who had been handed a way of living that defined warmth as a liability and formality as protection, and who passed that framework on without quite examining it. George V's private view of his eldest son is preserved in a sentence that became famous partly because it was so accurate. "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. He said this about Edward. He also prayed, reportedly, that his eldest son would never marry, so that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne. He saw it coming. He couldn't change his son, and he couldn't change what that would mean. The result was a set of children permanently marked by the deficit. Edward, David to the family, came out restless, emotionally stunted, drawn to dominant women, increasingly contemptuous of the responsibilities attached to his position. His private secretary, Alan Lascelles, who knew him thoroughly and eventually despaired of him, concluded that Edward possessed ethical impotence. Albert, Bertie, came out anxious, loyal, conscientious, and afflicted by a stammer severe enough that every public speech was an ordeal, calculated in advance and survived rather than delivered. The emotional deprivation was the inheritance. Coldness was the native language. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, when she eventually married into this family, turned out to be unusually fluent in it. In the early 1920s, the two brothers represented two very different propositions for any young woman who paid attention to such things. Edward, the Prince of Wales, was the most photographed celebrity on earth, a documented fact, not a figure of speech. An American trade journal called Men's Wear in 1924 observed that the average young man in America is more interested in the clothes of the Prince of Wales than in any other individual on earth. That was how it read in the trade press. In the social columns, it read differently: warm, vivid, intimate, as if he belonged slightly to everyone who looked at him. He had toured Australia in 1920, the first major post-war royal tour, arriving at 25 to crowds that newspapers struggled to describe adequately. A scholarly study of his 1919 Canadian visit describes him as using the stop at the Macdonald Institute in Guelph specifically to debut his persona as an eligible bachelor before the admiring young women of the institution. Prince Charming, celebrity ladies' man, is the academic's phrase, offered without irony, because that was how it functioned publicly. He was slim, tanned from outdoor sports, effortlessly comfortable with strangers in a way that passed for genuine warmth and was partly genuine warmth. What it concealed was boredom, self-contempt, and a private life he was already finding difficult to sustain. In letters to his married mistress, Frida Dudley Ward, written across the 1920s, he poured out an inner life that bore no resemblance to the public one. He complained about his advisors, the people he was obliged to entertain, his father, the monarchy itself. He described himself as a bolshie. He spoke of feeling like a prisoner. At moments, he spoke of suicide. He wrote to Frida that he was the kind of man who needs a certain amount of cruelty. His family saw the private man by degrees. The public never did. The contrast between the two brothers at any social gathering was that stark. One was the duck, the other the cock pheasant. The pheasant was Edward. The whole world knew which was which. Prince Albert was the duck. And to say this isn't to diminish him, because what the duck eventually became matters enormously. But at this specific moment in the early 1920s, the social calculation was clear. He had been forced to write right-handed despite being naturally left-handed. His legs had been put in corrective splints as a child for knock knees. His stammer, which worsened under stress and public scrutiny, made every formal appearance a test of endurance for both the man delivering the speech and the people trying to listen. On October 31, 1925, his closing speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley was so severely disrupted by the stammer that accounts describe it as painful to witness. An ordeal, in the words of one contemporary account, for both him and his listeners. He began working with Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist operating out of Harley Street, in 1926. The improvement over time was substantial. The visible effort never entirely vanished. He was created Duke of York in June 1920 and built his public identity around welfare work, chairing the Industrial Welfare Society, visiting mines and factory floors across the Midlands and the North, establishing annual summer camps that brought working-class and upper-class boys together on equal terms from 1921 onward. He was called the Industrial Prince. He was reliable, serious, unfailingly dutiful, physically active. He played doubles tennis at Wimbledon in 1926 with a partner, losing in the first round. And he wasn't the one any ambitious young woman was watching across a country house ballroom in 1920 or 1921. Not when his brother was also in the room. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon entered London society around 1918 or 1919 at 18. The youngest daughter of the Earl of Strathmore, vivacious, charming, the kind of young woman a room rearranged itself around without quite deciding to. Sally Bedell Smith, in her account of the marriage, describes her at this moment as the it girl of her aristocratic set. Her letters from the period are alive with a particular energy. She signed off on notes to her brother Jock with lines about rats squeaking in the walls at Glam's being melodious and soothing to a degree, and called them the little darlings. She used P.G. Wodehouse expressions, sprinkled tinkety-tonk and what ho through her correspondence. She was funny, and she knew she was funny, and she used it the way other women used beauty. She had also, in August 1919, lost the person she described as her only true friend. Charles Gordon Lennox, Lord Settington, killed serving in the North Russia Relief Force. She wrote that he was the only one I could talk to in a completely natural and simple way. He was dear to me, and I miss him very much. She came to the marriage market already knowing the cost of depending on anything. Albert met her, most likely at the Royal Air Force Ball at the Ritz Hotel on July 8, 1920, and fell in love with her that evening. She was vivacious and already trailing proposals behind her. He joined what Bedell Smith calls the queue. For more than 2 years, he courted her. He declared publicly, to his family, that he would marry no one else. His mother, Queen Mary, concerned about her son's single-minded fixation on a woman who had not yet accepted him, visited Glam's castle herself to assess the situation. She came away convinced that Elizabeth was the one girl who could make Bertie happy, but declined to exert pressure. There was also a rival in the room during this period. James Stuart, Albert's own equerry, courted Elizabeth during 1920 and 1921. Contemporary accounts describe her as besotted with him. Stuart was charming and available. Not a royal duke, not a throne in waiting, just a man she appeared to like very much. He eventually left royal service for better paid work in the American oil business. His departure was, depending on which biographer you follow, timely or deliberate or simply convenient. Either way, it removed him from the picture. Albert proposed for the first time on February 27, 1921, over lunch. Elizabeth refused. She wrote to him the following day. The letter survives, confirmed through William Shawcross's work with the correspondence, apologizing, offering continued friendship, working to soften the blow while leaving it intact. The refusal stood. In February 1922, she served as a bridesmaid at the Westminster Abbey wedding of Princess Mary, Albert's sister, to Viscount Lascelles. The following month, March 7, 1922, Albert proposed again. Refused again. Elizabeth wrote to him on March 8th. She was terribly sorry about what happened yesterday and called him one of her best and most faithful friends. A warm refusal is its own particular form of torment. He endured it. In early January 1923, Albert proposed a third time. According to the detailed centenary account from the Royal Watcher blog, drawing on the letters, Elizabeth took over a week to decide. Albert had, per the account, proposed continuously since the preceding Friday. She walked in the grounds at St. Paul's Waldenbury, the Strathmore's Hertfordshire house, with the question still open. She deliberated across 7 or 8 days in January. She weighed what she had: a lively, informal family life, freedom of thought and expression, the ability to move through society on her own terms, against what she was being offered, which was duty without limit and a public life she had no template for navigating comfortably. She had already said her own words on the subject from the first refusal. She was afraid never, never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. That was 1921. The fear had not dissolved. She was choosing, despite it. On the evening of Sunday, January 14, 1923, she accepted. Albert telegraphed his parents in 2 words, "All right, Bertie." The engagement was announced in the court circular on January 15th. They married at Westminster Abbey on April 26, 1923. Their rings crafted from 22-carat Welsh gold from the Clogau St. David's mine in Bontu, a source that would become a royal tradition. On her way into the abbey, Elizabeth laid her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior, in memory of her brother Fergus, killed at the Battle of Loo in 1915. The gesture was unplanned and unprecedented, and every royal bride since has done something equivalent. In her wedding diary that evening, she wrote that she was very tired and happy, in bed by midnight. The marriage was made. Now, her own stated reason for hesitation is confirmed fact. The fear of enclosure, of losing the self to the institution, is in her own words. What isn't in her own words, and what no major biographer has found in any primary source, is any indication that she was watching the elder brother and finding the younger one a lesser option. Sally Bedell Smith, who worked directly from the surviving correspondence, calls the "She Wanted Edward" reading highly unlikely, a retrospective story assembled to explain an animosity that seemed to need an origin. The letters from Elizabeth's refusals are warm toward Albert, anxious about royal life. They don't mention David. In early January 1923, contemporary gossip briefly and incorrectly suggested she was engaged to Albert's elder brother, but Bedell Smith notes she scarcely knew Edward, whose playboy antics were familiar to the aristocracy and London café society. What is documented is the hesitation itself. 2 full refusals, a week of deliberation before the yes, and a life of social circulation in a world where both brothers were present. The press assumed the pairing with David naturally enough to report it, briefly, wrongly, but with enough plausibility to run. She didn't need to know David well to know what he represented. The confusion itself places her in an atmosphere where the assumption was conceivable. The "She Wanted David" reading is inference, not confession. Stated as such, it still does considerable work, because the documented ambivalence is real, and what came after it's too sustained and too precise to be explained entirely by moral principle. Bessie Wallis Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, at Square Cottage in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, a summer resort hotel popular with Baltimoreans escaping the season's heat. Her father, Teakle Wallis Warfield, died of tuberculosis in November 1896, 5 months after her birth. She grew up in Baltimore on the charity of wealthier relatives, with a controlling bachelor uncle, Solomon Davies Warfield, who dispensed money in irregular amounts and expected gratitude in return. Her mother took in lodgers, sold needlework, and worked as a country club hostess. A former schoolmate remembered, "She was bright, brighter than all of us. She made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and she did." She arrived at adulthood already practiced at reading rooms, understanding who had power in them, what they needed from her, and how to supply it invisibly enough to seem natural. She married Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a U.S. Navy aviator, in November 1916 at Christ Episcopal Church in Baltimore. He drank before flying. That marriage ended formally in December 1927. In July 1928, she married Ernest Aldrich Simpson, a British shipping executive, at a Chelsea register office. She had telegraphed her acceptance of his proposal from Cannes, where she was staying with friends. By 1929, The Wall Street crash had wiped out her investments. Ernest was beginning to have financial difficulties of his own. The Simpsons were living beyond their means and had to dismiss successive staff. She had no money of her own, no property, no independent country she fully belonged to. Her position rested entirely on Ernest's willingness to maintain it, and that willingness was increasingly strained. She met Edward at Borough Court, near Melton Mowbray, Leicestershire, on January 10, 1931, introduced by Lady Thelma Furness, his current mistress and Wallis's friend. The meeting left no immediate impression on either of them. Over the following 3 years, the Simpsons attended various country house parties where Edward was present. Wallis was presented at court. The intimacy developed by degrees. By January 1934, while Thelma was away in New York, Wallis had become Edward's mistress. By the end of that year, he was, in the words of his official biographer, slavishly dependent on her. What she gave him was harder to itemize than wealth or beauty, neither of which she had in exceptional quantities. She listened, completely, with the focus of someone for whom the person in front of her was the only person alive. Her wit was dry and economical, a remark deployed like a hatpin at the precise moment of maximum effect. Edward's courtiers noticed that she could be abrasive with him in a way that left him not wounded, but attentive. She seems to have understood intuitively that what he said he needed was what he said in letters to Frida Dudley Ward, a certain amount of cruelty. He had been told all his life that he was magnificent. He was apparently drawn to the one person who declined to agree. The Yorks stopped visiting Fort Belvedere, Edward's preferred Surrey retreat, before the abdication made any of it unavoidable. Bedell Smith notes that Elizabeth initially took pleasure in Edward's company and wrote him breezy and affectionate letters. But his selfishness, his narcissism, his readiness to discard people who no longer served him, all of it pulled Albert and Elizabeth away from him by degrees, across the years before Wallis became the central issue. The formal distance accumulated into something colder and more deliberate. Once the abdication was determined, Hugo Vickers argues in Behind Closed Doors, Wallis found herself with very little choice. She had no money, no independent position, and a man who had surrendered the British throne specifically to marry her. She couldn't refuse him now. She was left with a duke and a country she could never again fully enter, and she remained loyal to him for the 35 years that followed. Not a saint, not the calculating seductress of received legend either. A woman with no exit, making the best of the room she was locked in, and entirely aware of who had done the locking. On December 10, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere, with his 3 surviving brothers present. Albert was there. The day before, he had driven to London to see his mother. He wrote in his diary, "When I told her what had happened, I broke down and sobbed like a child." On December 11, 1936, Prince Albert became King George VI. His wife Elizabeth, 36 years old, became Queen Consort. His brother's broadcast that evening was heard across Britain and across much of the world. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." Edward left for Austria. Albert took the throne using the regnal name George VI, choosing it deliberately to signal continuity with his father, to communicate that the institution had survived the man who had nearly broken it. The coronation was held on May 12, 1937, at Westminster Abbey, the date originally set for Edward's. Elizabeth wore a crown of platinum set with the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The 2 daughters watched from a box in the Abbey. In the photographs, she looks contained and certain. In the private record, she was beginning to build a case. This is the moment the standard story starts. And it isn't wrong, But it isn't the beginning. The abdication didn't create the grievance. It handed it a crown. George VI died on February 6, 1952, of coronary thrombosis after surgery for lung cancer. He had undergone a lung resection the previous September after diagnosis. He was 56. He had been a heavy smoker his entire adult life, as had his father before him, and the combination of the smoking and the sustained psychological stress of a wartime kingship he had never been meant to hold had done its work steadily and without announcement. Elizabeth believed, and said so in various forms for the rest of her life, that the abdication and its consequences had shortened her husband's life. That David's abdication had placed Bertie in the position that killed him. That Wallis, by capturing the elder brother and removing the abdication as an impossibility, had killed the younger one by increments. That belief is documented across multiple sources and consistent across decades. It also performs a specific function. It gives the hostility a moral frame. A wife defending her husband's memory. Grief translated into principle. The private wound wearing its constitutional clothing. This does not make the grief false, but it does make the framing selective, because the coldness toward the Windsors predates February 1952, predates the war, predates even December 1936. It was there in the stopped visits to Fort Belvedere before anyone had announced a constitutional crisis. The abdication didn't create the grudge. It gave the grudge legal instruments. The exhibits come in sequence. On May 27, 1937, 6 months after the abdication, letters patent reconferred the style of Royal Highness on Edward as Duke of Windsor. The same document explicitly declared that his wife and descendants, if any, shall not hold said title or attribute. Wallis was the Duchess of Windsor. She wasn't Her Royal Highness. She could curtsy to members of the royal family. They weren't required to reciprocate. This asymmetry was the point. In a family where hierarchy expressed itself through deference, denying the HRH wasn't a technical distinction, it was a permanent statement about what Wallis was. The formal act was George VI's, constitutionally his, enacted with cabinet support and the concurrence of the Dominion governments. But Elizabeth and Queen Mary pressed hard for the denial. George VI's letter to Edward explaining the decision conveyed that he and his family, including Queen Mary, felt it would be a great mistake to acknowledge Mrs. Simpson as a suitable person to become royal, and that the monarchy had been degraded quite enough already. Edward's response was equally direct. He called the denial a nice wedding present and vowed he wouldn't return to England unless Wallis received equal treatment. The equal treatment never arrived. On June 3, 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor married at Château de Condé, near Tours, France, a ceremony conducted by a Church of England vicar named Jardine, who had been specifically warned by his bishop that he had no episcopal consent to officiate, and who went ahead anyway. No member of the British royal family attended. Edward had accepted this. What reportedly cut more deeply was what followed. Not the absence at one wedding, but the absence that continued for decades, precisely calibrated, never quite absolute enough to create an international incident, but never loose enough to allow a genuine return. Elizabeth and Queen Mary simply wouldn't receive Wallis. Invitations that courtiers periodically floated, Ascot, weekend stays at Windsor, were reportedly blocked by the Queen, who understood what her mother would say. George VI's government threatened to cut Edward's allowance if he returned to Britain uninvited, making any unsanctioned return financially unworkable. A letter documented by The Telegraph in 2009, a 70-year-old letter from approximately 1939, records Elizabeth's formal refusal to receive Wallis at Buckingham Palace. In the early 1940s, a letter attributed to Elizabeth in a royalty magazine archival feature described Wallis in terms of withering personal contempt, written in the context of Wallis's suitability as a governor's wife in the Bahamas, where Edward was serving. One document, one specific context, but the phrasing is consistent with the private vocabulary that multiple biographers have independently confirmed. Elizabeth referred to Wallis as that woman. Anne Seba used this phrase as the title of her 2011 biography of Wallis, noting its currency among the Queen Mother and other family members. Wallis returned the favor in her own way. She called Elizabeth Cookie, apparently on account of a resemblance, in her estimation, to a fat Scottish cook. Stephen Tennant, who knew Elizabeth and wasn't hostile to her, left the sharpest description in the record. She looked everything that she wasn't: gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. Cecil Beaton, the photographer who knew her well enough to spend long sessions in her company, offered his own version: a marshmallow made on a welding machine. Both men were describing the same quality: real warmth backed by real steel, and neither was trying to diminish her. They were registering something that most public accounts of the Queen Mother simply didn't include. The Duke of Grafton, a close friend, gave what sounds like a denial, but functions as something else entirely. He insisted she never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. Except. The qualifier carries the weight. The single documented in-person encounter between Elizabeth and Wallis after the abdication is the Marlborough House handshake of June 1967. The one at the opening of this script, the 7 words that ended in a body moving away. 31 years, one brief exchange. The Queen Mother had initially refused to attend if Wallis was present. She was persuaded otherwise, and she came. And she was exactly civil enough to make the civility a statement. "How nice to see you." Moving on. Wallis, already 70, and beginning to feel the first effects of the arteriosclerosis that would eventually take her speech, stood in the room where the encounter happened, and then watched it end. The family moved on to the reception. She was present at the event. She wasn't present in any meaningful sense at the gathering. The life the Windsors built in Paris is its own exhibit. Villa Windsor, at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the 16th arrondissement, leased from the French government at a nominal rent, occupied the northwest section of the Bois de Boulogne, a formal, leafy address, correct in every detail of its surroundings, available to them because nothing more official was. They arrived as the couple that had disrupted the British succession and found that their options for a permanent home were limited to the generosity of foreign governments willing to be seen housing them. The French government was willing. Wallis ran the household with a precision that guests consistently remarked on. Town and Country's photographers found a house covered in pug-related imagery, portraits, ceramic figurines, framed photographs in every room. The Windsors kept multiple pugs throughout their Paris years, and this appeared to be genuine affection rather than decorative quirk. The household maintained structured staff and secretaries well into the early 1970s. Even as Edward's health deteriorated, the domestic surfaces were kept immaculate. When guests came for dinner, the table was set with ceremony. The flowers were arranged with the focus of someone who had learned that this was the domain entirely her own, because the official world was permanently sealed. The HRH she'd been denied in 1937 wasn't something she could argue back into existence. No letter, no phone call, no visit to London changed the legal position. The dinner table was hers. The flowers were hers. The rooms that the pug portraits covered were, in a real sense, the kingdom she had been left with, and she administered it with the perfectionism of a woman who understood that the alternative to doing it well wasn't doing it at all. One account mentions Wallis keeping a notepad and gilt pencil close at hand, a detail specific enough to carry weight, though not corroborated widely enough to build on. What is confirmed across multiple guest accounts is the controlled surface, the performance of a life lived at the standard of one the institution had never officially recognized, executed with the same care every day because letting it slip wasn't available as an option. Edward died here, at this address, 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, at 2:25 in the morning on May 28, 1972. He was 77. Throat cancer had done what the abdication, the exile, and the 35 years of managed distance had not. He was a heavy smoker, like his father before him. His body was flown to RAF Benson. It lay in state at Windsor for 3 days. Queue barriers stretched half a mile down Castle Hill, and thousands of mourners filed through the Albert Memorial Chapel past his coffin. The blue carpeting on the catafalque, the large candle holder at each corner, the cross of white Easter lilies given by Wallis, which surmounted the coffin, the royal standard draped over it. He had the staging of a king without having been one for more than 11 months. By June 1972, Wallis was already suffering from mental confusion caused by arteriosclerosis. She was 75. She had agreed to come to England for the funeral, which required crossing into a country that had never fully accepted her, to bury a man whose decision to marry her had changed the course of her life in ways she had not entirely chosen, in the company of a family that had spent 35 years making the terms of her exclusion precise and legible. She was nervous. Specifically, according to Hugo Vickers' biography, cited in the Wikipedia article on the Duke's funeral, she was nervous about meeting Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who had a long-held antipathy toward her due to the strain that Edward's abdication had had on her husband. Lord Mountbatten sought to reassure her before the visit. He told her, "Your sister-in-law will receive you with open arms. She is deeply sorry for you in your present grief, and remembers what it was like when her husband died." This was the kind of thing you say to a grieving woman who is about to walk into a room she has been barred from for 3 decades. Whether Mountbatten believed it's a separate question. Wallis stayed at Buckingham Palace as the Queen's guest during the visit. The palace was where she was housed, the institution extending the minimum courtesy required. The Queen met with her once during the stay, on the day of the funeral. Once, in several days of bereavement. The funeral service at St. George's Chapel began at 11:15 a.m. on June 5th and lasted 30 minutes. The bell in the tower had tolled for an hour before the service started. Wallis sat in the chapel beside Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. The Queen Mother was also present, alongside Prince Charles, Princess Anne, Princess Margaret, and the Earl of Snowdon. Prime Minister Edward Heath attended. King Olav V of Norway, the Garter King of Arms, recited Edward's titles as monarch. The last post was played, then the reveille. The hymn, "Lead Us, Heavenly Father, Lead Us," was sung. The lesson was read from chapters 4 and 5 of 2 Corinthians. After the service, Edward was buried at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, attended by only 14 people. The Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, John Utter, the Duke's private secretary, who had traveled with Wallis to England and who returned with her to Paris. Wallis flew back to France that day, with Utter beside her. The logistics were handled. What logistics couldn't provide was the other thing, the sense that the people around her were grieving the same loss. The record indicates the Queen met Wallis once during her entire stay in England, on the day of the funeral. A partial account from a book on the period describes the family departing for the country at the close of the weekend, their lives resuming their accustomed rhythm. Wallis's grief was an obligation the institution could accommodate without absorbing. She had been brought over, housed, accompanied through the service, and seen off. The curtains were drawn. The family went on to the next thing. Elizabeth attended the service. She didn't seek out the widow before or after. Wallis died on April 24, 1986, at Villa Windsor, the same address where Edward had died 14 years before. She was 89. Her final decade had been a progressive erasure. Suzanne Bloom, her Parisian lawyer, had taken effective control of her affairs, her communications, and eventually her access to the outside world, as dementia and arteriosclerosis progressed together. By 1980, Wallis had lost the ability to speak. She suffered multiple strokes. She broke her hip twice. She spent her last years largely confined to bed, attended by her doctor and nurses, no longer receiving visitors. Foxed Quarterly, reviewing Hugo Vickers's Behind Closed Doors, described what Vickers documented in those final years as the chilling steps that left the Duchess powerless and trapped in a body that didn't know how to die. Her funeral at St. George's Chapel on April 29, 1986, was attended by 175 mourners. Queen Elizabeth II attended, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen Mother, the Prince and Princess of Wales, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. No eulogies were delivered. No direct references to the Duchess were made during the ceremony. Once, in a prayer, a canon referred to her as our sister. The service lasted 28 minutes. The silver plaque on her polished English oak coffin read, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 1896 to 1986. No HRH prefix. 49 years after the letter's patent, the denial was still on the medal. The Queen Mother wasn't present at the gravesite for the burial. This was, the record shows, on the advice of Queen Elizabeth II. Wallis was buried beside Edward at Frogmore. The inscription on his stone carried the Royal Highness. Hers didn't. Here is what the record establishes firmly. Albert proposed 3 times. Elizabeth refused twice and accepted the 3rd time in January 1923, after more than a week of deliberation. Her stated reason for hesitation, preserved in her own words, was the fear of losing personal freedom. Her documented hostility toward the Windsors was sustained across more than 6 decades, precise in its instruments, and consistent in its effect. The HRH denial, the refused receptions, the archived letter of 1939, the Bahamas correspondence, the 7 words at Marlborough House, the single meeting during the funeral visit, the absent Queen Mother at Wallis's graveside, the HRH still missing from the coffin in 1986. These are confirmed facts. Here is what the record does not establish: that Elizabeth hesitated because she wanted the elder brother specifically. Bedell Smith, working from the letters, considers that reading highly unlikely, retrospective, assembled to explain an animosity that seemed to need a personal origin. The letters from the refusal years don't mention David. The January 1923 gossip linking Elizabeth to the Prince of Wales was briefly reported and quickly corrected. What the record supports is a more careful inference. A young woman who spent 2 years declining a man she ultimately married. A woman operating in a social world where the glamorous elder brother was the constant gravitational force at every party, every country house, every RAF ball, present, beautiful, apparently available, and not available at all in any real sense. A woman who then spent the remainder of her life ensuring that brother and his chosen woman paid a sustained and precisely administered price. Whether the motor was wounded pride, genuine constitutional indignation, or the documented conviction that Wallis had killed her husband by proxy, probably all 3, in different proportions at different moments, the behavior runs on the same track across 66 years. The abdication gave the grievance institutional tools. The institutional tools were used with a precision that moral principle alone doesn't fully explain. William Shawcross's official biography and his edited volume of her letters reveal an enthusiastic and warm correspondent, breezy, funny, affectionate, genuinely fond of the people she loved. Cecil Beaton and Stephen Tennant, who knew her and admired her, both registered the steel behind the marshmallow. The Duke of Grafton insisted she never said anything nasty about Wallis, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. That single word, except, is its own small, polished exhibit in the case. The structural pattern this story follows isn't unique to 1936. An outsider marries into an ancient institution. A prince chooses her over the established obligations. The family closes ranks. quietly, thoroughly, across years and across generations. The outsider ends up exiled, too visible to be ignored entirely, too unwelcome to be absorbed. Money and status are managed and restricted. Warmth is simply withheld. There is a more recent version of this arrangement that audiences will recognize without being told its names. The American woman, the departing prince, the family that doesn't quite forgive, the institution that always wins on the final paperwork. The machinery runs on the same fuel. It produces the same output. In this family, the coldest people won. They always did. Elizabeth was publicly adored for a century. By British crowds, by Commonwealth audiences, by the press that photographed her smiling at absolutely everything. She earned it. Her presence during the war years was genuine. Her warmth for the people who came to see her was genuine. She stayed in London during the Blitz with her daughters when the cabinet advised her to leave. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times while they were there. She said afterward, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." That wasn't performance. That was character. But she held something in permanent reserve for one specific destination, and it was never released. Not for the abdication, not for Edward's death, not for the funeral with its 14 people at the graveside in June 1972. Not for Wallis's long isolated years in Paris under Suzanne Bloom's control. Not for the coffin with the wrong plaque. The man who may once have stood at the center of her awareness, the golden one, the cock pheasant, the Prince of Wales who set the fashion pages of New York, was buried at Frogmore while his widow flew back to France with the Duke's secretary beside her. The family attended the funeral in the correct numbers, said the correct things, and went on to their weekend. The grudge outlasted the man it was built around. It outlasted Wallis. It may, in some structural form, outlast them all. And if you want the precise proof that the hostility was never only about constitutional principle, about the church, the monarchy, the unsuitability of a twice-divorced American, look at the plaque on the coffin in April 1986. Still no HRH. 49 years after the letter's patent were issued, with the woman inside unable to speak or argue or correct anything, the institution still got the final word on the medal. Not because it was legally required, because no one in the family had chosen to do otherwise. That is the thing Elizabeth Bowes Lyon never did, choose otherwise. Not at the end, not even for the dead. Subscribe for more stories like this.